In December 1941, as the rising sun crested over the Pacific, Japan's aircraft carriers unleashed a storm of fire on Pearl Harbor. The attack shattered steel and spirit alike, plunging America into a war it had not sought but would soon define. Yet even as black smoke curled over the battleship row, a different kind of war had already begun. One fought not by admirals at sea but by engineers, welders, and shipwrights thousands of miles away. The Pacific War would not be won by courage alone. It would be won by capacity, the capacity to build, repair, and replace faster than an enemy could destroy. Japan had entered the war with 6 fleet carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They were masterpieces of naval engineering, each one a floating fortress of steel and rising ambition. But they were also fragile in one crucial way. They could not be replaced quickly. Across the ocean in the shipyards of California, Washington, and Virginia, an industrial awakening was beginning to roar. America, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, turned its anger into blueprints, its grief into production schedules. In the early months of 1942, Japanese naval power ruled the Pacific. Their carriers struck with impunity, from the Philippines to Ceylon, from the Coral Sea to the Aleutians. The rising sun seemed unstoppable, but beneath the surface, America's shipyards were beginning to hum. Every factory whistle that blew in California or Oregon was a battle cry. Every spark that flew from a welder's torch was a counterstrike. The great industrial machine of the United States, idle during the Depression, was awakening with purpose. The architects of this transformation were not soldiers, but visionaries of steel. Henry J. Kaiser, an industrial titan, looked at shipbuilding and saw inefficiency where others saw tradition. He revolutionized the process with one radical idea: prefabrication. Instead of building ships piece by piece in one place, Kaiser divided the process into sections, components built separately and then assembled like a vast metallic puzzle. It was an idea borrowed from Henry Ford's automobile assembly lines, scaled up to the size of cities. At the start of 1942, it took the United States over 2 years to build a single aircraft carrier. By 1944, they were launching one every few months. As America was learning to build faster, Japan was learning how hard it was to keep up. The Imperial Navy's shipyards were small, scattered, and reliant on skilled labor that took years to train. Each carrier required precision craftsmanship, a process the Japanese refused to simplify, believing that quality alone would prevail. They were building masterpieces. America was building machines of war. The difference would decide the fate of the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the industrial tide began to turn. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval clash fought entirely by aircraft, crippled 2 of Japan's prized carriers. 1 month later at Midway, American intelligence and industrial resilience combined to deliver a decisive blow. 4 of Japan's 6 main carriers were sent to the ocean floor in just 2 days. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The heart of the Imperial Navy had been ripped out, and Japan had no replacements ready. While Japanese shipyards struggled to lay new keels, across the Pacific, American steel mills burned day and night. At Newport News, Virginia, massive hulls rose like mountains of iron. In California's Mare Island, the night sky flickered orange with the glow of torches, and in Oregon, Kaiser's shipyards began breaking records the world had never seen. The first of the Essex-class carriers, USS Essex, CV-9, was launched in 1942, a floating symbol of industrial vengeance. She was larger, faster, and more resilient than any carrier that had come before her, and she would not be alone. From 1942 to 1945, 17 Essex-class fleet carriers would join the U.S. Navy, so many that historians later stopped counting the variants and conversions that followed. These ships would form the backbone of the American fleet, each one capable of unleashing hundreds of aircraft against distant shores. While Japanese shipyards launched 1 or 2 replacements over the course of years, America launched a fleet so vast that by 1944, naval officers joked they were running out of names. This was not just production, it was transformation. Factories that once built cars now forged fighter wings. Women who once sewed dresses now welded steel. Teenagers worked night shifts beside veterans of the Great Depression. Entire cities were reborn as war machines. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Richmond, California, turned into the city that built the fleet. By late 1943, the Pacific balance was shifting. For every carrier Japan lost, America built 3 more. For every bomber Japan sent into the sky, America built 10. This was the moment when war became mathematics, and America had rewritten the equation. Steel, manpower, and time. These were the currencies of victory. In Japan, the situation was desperate. The country's shipyards, limited by geography and resources, faced relentless bombing. Supplies of oil, iron, and copper dwindled. Even when new carriers were launched, like the Taiho and Shinano, they were too few, too late, and built under siege. By contrast, in America, production was no longer a question of if, only how fast. In 1944 alone, American shipyards built more tonnage than all the Axis powers combined. The numbers were staggering. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and above all, carriers, poured from the slipways like an unstoppable tide. The Pacific Ocean, once ruled by Japan's carriers, was now filled with American decks stretching to the horizon. Each carrier was not just a ship, it was a city of war. 1,000 men, 90 aircraft, endless rows of munitions and machinery, a floating embodiment of American determination. And while Japan counted its losses, America stopped counting its production, because by then, the question was no longer whether they could win, but how swiftly they could end it. As 1944 dawned, the great industrial wave that began in America's shipyards was ready to crash across the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would test everything, the ships, the planes, and the men who built them. But the foundation of that victory had been laid long before, not at Midway, not at Guadalcanal, but in the roaring, fire-lit shipyards of a nation that learned how to turn steel into supremacy. The factories had become the front lines, and the front lines were unstoppable. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean had changed its face. Where once the rising sun had glared across unchallenged horizons, the sky now shimmered with the silver wings of American carrier-borne aircraft. The ocean that had been Japan's empire of conquest was becoming its prison. But this victory was not born on the waves. It was forged in the fires of industry, in the noise, sweat, and rhythm of a nation that had transformed itself into a single, colossal factory. Every bolt, every rivet, every section of steel that rolled out of a shipyard was a message. We can build faster than you can destroy. In the Kaiser yards, the impossible was now routine. Ships that once took months to assemble now slipped into the sea after weeks. Entire hull sections arrived on rail cars, already painted, wired, and ready to be welded into place. The phrase "launched ahead of schedule" lost its meaning because there was no longer such a thing as schedule. There was only speed. At the same time, in Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit, factories originally designed for automobiles were producing aircraft engines, propellers, and components for ships. Ford's Willow Run plant became a legend in itself, rolling out a new B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. And while bombers filled the skies, the carriers that would launch naval aircraft followed a similar rhythm. The Essex-class carriers were multiplying. USS Intrepid, USS Yorktown, USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill, USS Hornet, USS Hancock, each one a steel cathedral of American might, each one a weapon of precision and endurance. But these ships were not just built to float. They were built to dominate. Every Essex-class carrier could carry up to 90 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, a small air force on every deck. Their elevators lifted planes with mechanical grace. Their engines thundered with 150,000 horsepower. Every ship was a moving storm, and the Pacific was now filled with storms. In Japan, desperation grew. The Imperial Navy's last hopes rested on innovation. New ships, new planes, new tactics. The Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier, was launched in 1944. It was fast, heavily armored, and built to rival the Essex. But even this technological marvel faced the same fatal problem. There were simply not enough of them. Japan had 1 Taiho. America had 17 Essex-class carriers, and more under construction. The difference wasn't just numbers. It was momentum. When Japan lost a carrier, the blow was permanent. When America lost one, it was replaced within months, sometimes weeks. That speed became the true weapon of the United States. And now, that weapon was ready to strike. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It began with calm seas and a tense silence. American radar screens flickered to life, tracking hundreds of incoming dots. Japanese bombers and torpedo planes racing toward the American fleet. The Imperial Navy had gambled everything on this massive, offensive, an attempt to crush America's growing dominance before it became irreversible. But what awaited them was not the America of 1942. It was an America rebuilt in steel, dozens of carriers, Essex class, light carriers and escort ships stretched across the horizon. Thousands of aircraft waited in launch positions, their propellers slicing the morning air. When the Japanese squadrons arrived, the sky erupted. The battle that followed would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japan lost over 350 aircraft, the cream of its naval aviation, while American losses barely reached double digits. It wasn't luck. It was infrastructure. Behind every American pilot stood a factory worker, a mechanic, a shipwright, a designer, an entire civilization of production supporting every mission. Japan, once the hunter, had become the hunted. The Taiho, pride of the Japanese fleet, was struck by a single torpedo from the submarine USS Albacore. Fumes filled her hangars, and hours later, a massive explosion tore through her decks. She sank beneath the waves, taking hundreds of crew with her. And with her, Japan's last hope for a decisive naval victory. Meanwhile, American shipyards kept delivering. The USS Ticonderoga, USS Bennington, and USS Randolph were already in the pipeline. The carriers weren't just ships anymore. They were production lines at sea. When Japan sent 20 aircraft, America launched 200. When Japan built one carrier, America launched 3. The industrial race was over. America had won it before the battle even began. In the shipyards, the pace didn't slow. Every hammer strike still carried purpose, every spark still spoke defiance. Even as victory approached, America's factories refused to rest. For them, the end of one war meant preparation for another. The genius of the Essex-class program wasn't only the ships themselves, it was the system behind them. The blueprints were standardized, allowing shipyards across the nation to share components, techniques, and even personnel. Welders trained in Portland could join a team in Norfolk without missing a beat. Engineers swapped designs by mail faster than Japan could replace a single damaged keel. The result was more than efficiency. It was unity. America was building not just ships, but a network of collaboration that spanned a continent, and that unity powered the next wave of war. By late 1944, the U.S. Navy had become a mobile empire, fleets of floating airfields capable of striking anywhere, anytime. The Philippine Sea was just the beginning. The battles that followed, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would prove that industrial power could dictate destiny. Every new Essex-class carrier that slid into the water was another nail in Japan's coffin, and every rivet hammered in a shipyard was one more heartbeat in the rhythm of victory. Japan's shipyards, meanwhile, lay silent under the roar of American bombers. Oil reserves were gone. Factories without power stood idle. The imperial dream of naval supremacy had burned out. The war that had begun with Japan's 6 carriers now faced its reckoning at the hands of America's 17, and more still coming. But perhaps the greatest symbol of this industrial miracle wasn't found in the Pacific at all. It was found in the hands of ordinary people, those who built the ships, filled the shells, and believed that every hour spent in the factory was one less day of war. Their story was not told on the radio or printed in the headlines, but it lived in every victory at sea. When the American carriers launched their planes over the Marianas, the roar that filled the sky wasn't just from engines. It was the sound of a nation in motion, a nation that had learned the ultimate secret of modern war, that the battle is won long before the first shot is fired. As the sun set on the Philippine Sea, Japan's air power lay shattered. The waves were littered with burning wreckage, and yet in America's shipyards the night shift was just beginning. The workers didn't celebrate. They simply kept building, because even then they knew the war wasn't over yet. But its ending had already been written in steel. By early 1945, the Pacific was no longer an ocean of uncertainty. It had become a highway of steel. American carriers, cruisers, and destroyers stretched from horizon to horizon, their silhouettes etched against a burning sky. The war that had begun with the thunder of Japanese planes over Pearl Harbor was now ending beneath the shadows of American decks that seemed endless. Japan's empire, once expanding like fire across Asia, was shrinking into smoke. The rising sun still flew, but it flew above ruins. In Tokyo's shipyards, cranes stood silent. The sound of hammers had faded into the hum of sirens and the echo of air raids. Every ton of steel that had once promised victory now lay buried beneath ash. The United States, meanwhile, had become something the world had never seen before, an industrial superpower capable of constructing entire navies, faster than its enemies could destroy them. Factories that had once made refrigerators now turned out torpedoes, automobile. Plants built tank engines and carrier elevators. Every industry had bent toward one purpose: to build, to replace, to overwhelm, and they succeeded. The Essex-class carriers kept rolling off the slips, one after another, as if the very earth was giving birth to warships. The USS Bonhomme Richard, USS Lake Champlain, USS Boxer, USS Antietam, each one a symbol of how deep American production ran. The figures were staggering. By 1945, the United States had constructed over 120 aircraft carriers, from fleet giants to escort vessels, and more than 6,000 ships of all types. Japan, exhausted and blockaded, could barely launch a handful. What had started as a contest of fleets had become a test of nations, and Japan had reached the end of its endurance. The last of the Imperial Navy's dreams was the Shinano, the largest carrier ever built at that time, converted from the hull of a super battleship. She was vast, armored, formidable, but she never had a chance. Launched in November 1944, she sailed with her paint still wet, her crew untrained, her systems incomplete. Within days, the submarine USS Archerfish found her beneath the dark waves and struck with 4 torpedoes. In 7 hours, she sank, taking 1,000 men with her and sealing the fate of Japan's naval ambitions forever. While Japan's last great ship slipped beneath the sea, American carriers filled it. The USS Enterprise, battered but unbowed, led fleets across the Pacific. The USS Essex, Yorktown, and Intrepid launched relentless strikes on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. From these decks rose clouds of aircraft that darkened the sky. Each takeoff carried the weight of a nation's will. At Iwo Jima, Marines fought for every inch of volcanic ash. Above them, carrier planes provided unending cover. At Okinawa, kamikaze pilots hurled themselves against American ships, burning, crashing, dying, but even then, for every carrier hit, 2 more arrived to take its place. America had reached a point where loss no longer meant weakness. It meant momentum. The workers back home understood this instinctively. In the Kaiser yards, a sign hung over the gates. The faster we build, the sooner they come home. And so they built, through storms, through exhaustion, through grief, men and women side by side, turning raw material into salvation. Every new launch ceremony was not a celebration of war. It was a promise of ending it. By mid-1945, Japan's Navy existed only on paper. Its ports were graveyards. Its pilots, young boys with no fuel and no future. The war that had begun with 6 proud carriers was ending with none. Then came Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The final proof that industrial science had become something far greater and far more terrifying than any weapon of the sea. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the decks around her were filled with the ships of a nation that had mastered mass production. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and a forest of masts and flags stretching as far as the eye could see. The war had been fought across thousands of miles of ocean, but in the end, It was decided in the furnaces and factories of America. The legacy of that industrial triumph would outlive the war itself. From the ashes of conflict rose a new kind of power, not just military, but economic, technological, global. The same methods that had built the Essex carriers would later build the post-war world: cars, planes, cities, and highways. Mass production had become not just a wartime necessity but a blueprint for modern civilization. And the aircraft carrier, once a symbol of desperation and innovation, became the centerpiece of global strategy. Every nation would study America's example: the power of organization, the science of efficiency, the marriage of design and speed. Japan, too, would rise again, not through conquest, but through industry. In the decades after the war, the same discipline that once built warships began building cars, electronics, and machines of peace. The same spirit of craftsmanship found a new purpose. But the lesson of those years remained carved into history. In modern war, it is not the strongest army that wins, it is the fastest builder. The Battle of the Pacific had not truly been fought on the ocean at all. It had been fought in the shipyards, in the clanging of steel, in the rhythm of production, in the belief that a nation's strength lies in its ability to create. The Americans had built 17 carriers, and then they stopped counting, not because they couldn't build more, but because they no longer needed to. They had already proven the point. The carriers that once symbolized survival became the wings of dominance. From the Korean War to Vietnam, from the Cold War to the Gulf, their descendants would continue to patrol the seas, silent reminders of what industry can achieve when united by purpose. And so, when we look back at that era, at the smoke, the labor, the endless shift whistles echoing through the night, we see more than history. We see a revelation. That victory, in the end, belongs not to those who fight hardest, but to those who build fastest. The shipyards of America had done more than defeat an empire. They had changed the definition of power itself. As the last sparks of the welding torches faded, and peace settled over the world once more, the message remained clear, timeless, and unshakable. Steel wins wars, industry wins empires, and human will turns both into destiny.